to speak here. My wife Nina is handing out the flyer that our group has put together. And by the way, I represent Protect the Peninsula's Future, which is a longtime environmental organization on the Olympic Peninsula, and also Save the Olympic Peninsula, which is a newly formed group, which is more directly associated with this electronic warfare range issue, which I'm going to talk about. We also work closely with Rick Abraham's group, Citizens of Eby's Reserve, and a couple other groups, Protect Olympic Peninsula, also known as POP, which has a very good Facebook website with a lot of the current developments on it, and West Coast Action Alliance. It was a group that we had a hand in forming, and I think later on
they're presenting later.
Karen Sullivan will say some words for them. But essentially, this all began last October for us, when a lady in Forks, Washington, which is a little town east of Port Angeles, discovered a notice in a post office, which talked about a proposal to create the Pacific Northwest Electronic Warfare Range. There had never been any newspaper advertisement about this on the Olympic Peninsula, even though the Forest Service regulations required it. Nobody knew anything about it. After this lady fretted about this for a couple of weeks, she took it to the publisher of the Forks Forum, a small town newspaper about 60 miles west of Port Angeles. And she put it on Facebook's page and got something like 4,000 hits in just a matter of days. And they went to the Forest Service and said, "What's this about? And why didn't you publish it in the local newspapers like you're supposed to?" Their response was, "We didn't think you would be interested." Well, let me tell you what this is about. The Olympic Peninsula is about 100 miles west of, the center is about 100 miles west of Seattle. We're south of Vancouver Island in British Columbia, south of the Strait of Juan de Fuca. Whidbey Island, where Rick lives, is at the east end of the Strait of Juan de Fuca, where the Strait of Juan de Fuca meets the inner Puget Sound. The electronic warfare range is essentially located across the north part of the Olympic Peninsula. And the planes from Whidbey Island will practice in this proposed warfare range. They're proposing as many as 153 of these Growler aircraft. They're EA-18Gs, loudest plane in the military. It developed as an announcement of the availability of an environmental assessment, which included only 15 sites on Olympic National Forest property where they would place mobile emitters to broadcast an electronic signal into the air. And the story was that the planes would come and try to detect that signal. There would be no attempt to jam that signal or counteract that signal, just purely detection. And nothing was going to change over what they've been doing for years. That was the story that they presented in a couple public meetings that developed after this notice was spotted. And the people started asking questions. And the Navy essentially said, well, we need to move the training from Mountain Home Air Force Base in Idaho over here because our crews need to spend an hour and a half a day with their families more, a couple times a week. That's number one reason. Number two reason was to save about $4 million a year in fuel costs. I've heard similar reasons offer today for other projects around the country. But there's all these common arguments you hear. And while the Navy made that argument, they totally ignored the effect of all these loud planes on Olympic National Park, which is our #1 tourism, #1 industry by far on the Olympic Peninsula. And they totally ignored the impact of the noise on all the people on the Olympic Peninsula. They totally just looked at their own selfish concerns, which were minor compared to what we think our concerns are. So when we looked into it more, a lot of things just didn't add up. One is there was never any study of the impact of these airplanes between Whidbey Island and the west side of the Olympic Peninsula, where we think the training range is primarily going to be located. Now, we aren't sure of that because there's no map that shows where the Pacific Northwest Electronic Warfare Range is to be situated. And we just recently have seen the reason for that, and I'll get to that later. But there was also no study of the impact of the airplanes in this electronic warfare range. The whole environmental assessment was only evaluating the impact of these mobile emitters, which are, to begin with, sort of like camper trucks with antennas on them. They're supposed to drive around the Forest Service roads and to, at different locations to see if the jets can spot them. And in the Air Force's arguments, or the Navy's arguments, they said, well, there won't be any impact from radiation because these emitters will only be directing upwards. There won't be any jamming radiation coming down. Well, the implication of that argument is that if there was to be jamming radiation coming down, there would be harm. But they led us to believe there won't be any, just pure detection. Well, we started looking closer and closer, and the whole story can sort of be told in some emails that were just made public a couple months ago, or about a month and a half ago, which were between the Forest Service and the Navy about what they really wanted to do. We found out 5 really important things from those emails. One is these 15 sites where these mobile emitters were going to go and come from and practice transmitting were only the tip of the iceberg. What the Navy really wanted to do was to drive these mobile emitters all around Olympic National Park, east side, north side, south side, west side, and use roads, I guess U.S. highways and county roads, to transmit from. In fact, these emails say this will provide really lifelike similarities to all sorts of training scenarios. And we'll pick and choose where we go to try to get as close to the real thing as we can. So suddenly, the issue wasn't these little 15 sites, but it was all around the Olympic Peninsula. And actually, the first paragraph of the first email said, the reason we need this is to practice electronic attack training. We've been doing this in Mountain Home Air Force Base, and we've got to move it over here because our pilots need an hour and a half a day more with their families. So right there in black and white is the real reason for this project. It's to practice jamming these these electronic, well, they're jamming stations. I mean, you know, in electronic warfare, there's ground-based radar that's trying to counteract aircraft, and then there's aircraft trying to counteract ground-based radar. So anyway, the Navy's biggest assurance it was just going to be detection, was just right out the window. So that's two, 1 and 2. Instead of just these 15 sites, they're going to be all around the peninsula. And 2, there's going to be electronic attack training. They also talked in these emails about wanting to use Olympic National Park roads. Park roads, not just Forest Service roads. And the fourth thing in here in these emails was a statement that the Forest Service wrote back to the Navy and said, look, we can't meet your, they made a request back in 2012 for a temporary permit. They said, we can't meet your November 1 deadline because this is going to involve low-flying aircraft. And because it involves low-flying aircraft, we're going to have to go through the NEPA procedures. Well, this was also just counter to everything the Navy had been saying. This was only going to involve aircraft at around 10,000 feet, above 10,000 feet. Well, here it is, black and white, low-flying aircraft, which isn't a real surprise, because if you look at a lot of Navy and Air Force publications, one involving a low-altitude training area, where they talk about the need to go as low as 100 feet to counteract radar stations. And then they also say, we aren't going to, these federal regulations, they say, but we're going to comply with the FAA rules, which prohibit these airplanes from coming within 500 feet of any person or building. Now, does that give all of you a lot of reassurance? So anyway, this was another little twist that we found out in these emails. But there was also a statement from the Forest Service saying, well, we'll give you some tips on how to shape your application to avoid regulatory pitfalls. And so lo and behold, after those emails, we never heard anything about low-flying aircraft. We never heard anything about electronic attack. It was all high-flying aircraft. So anyway, that's from the record. Basically, we have an EA that says nothing about the effect of the aircraft on the Olympic Peninsula. Am I running out of time? Okay. We have endangered marbled murrelets, which is a very interesting and rare seabird. We have endangered spotted owls, which is a marker species for the whole environment. Off the coast, we have endangered sea lions. We have endangered orca whales. Anyway, no discussion about this electronic warfare range and the aircraft in this environmental impact statement. And that's despite this 1988 master agreement between the Department of Defense and the Department of Agriculture, which is where the Forest Service is, that requires 3 things: that the DoD show there's no other available property, which was really tough here because this was a transfer of training from Mountain Home Air Force Base. They're already doing it there. They can continue doing it there. It also says you have to study the impacts of any related aircraft. Just says it black and white in this document. And it also says it has to be consistent with the Forest Management Act for the region. Simply isn't consistent. So they were just blatantly violating all these provisions in the master agreement. And the Forest Service, by the way, had the gall to tell us that the master agreement allowed this. when, and that was before anybody had ever heard about the master agreement. No one read it, and it was just an outright misrepresentation. So we think we have a really unique situation out here that should attract a lot of attention from politicians and people across the country. Turning a national park, which is probably 50% covered by this warfare range, and maybe 100%, because we now with these email revelations that they want to do this training all around the peninsula, we don't really know where it is because there's no map. And it's a World Heritage Site and an International Biosphere Reserve. And we have all sorts of endangered birds. And it's just, as far as I know, it's the first land grab of a national park to create a military training range. So we think if the Navy and the DoD is vulnerable on any front, this could be a real poster child for the anti-Navy group. So we're glad to be here. We're glad to offer our help to all of you, and we would sure like your help too.